September 1st, 1939. Warsaw shook under German bombs as Adolf Hitler launched the invasion of Poland. That same morning, 3,500 miles west in Washington, a 58-year-old officer named George Catlett Marshall walked through the doors of the War Department for the first time as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He had just been promoted 3 grades in rank, skipping past 33 more senior generals to take command of a military force that barely qualified as an army. Marshall had chosen his wardrobe carefully that day. He wore a plain white civilian suit, not his dress uniform. He wanted no one to think he was eager for the conflict spreading across Europe. At 10:30, Secretary of War Harry Woodring administered the oath. By then, Poland's capital was engulfed in flames. The force Marshall inherited was a disaster. America fielded fewer than 190,000 soldiers in uniform. The entire army ranked 19th globally, behind Portugal, behind Switzerland, behind Belgium. Germany had just crossed into Poland with 1.5 million men organized into battle-tested divisions. The entire United States Army could have been absorbed by a single German army group. Equipment dated to the trenches of 1918. Soldiers trained with trucks painted with the word tank, because the nation owned fewer than 500 actual tanks. Artillery pieces were relics. Rifles were Springfield bolt actions carried by doughboys a generation earlier. 9 infantry divisions existed on paper, but only 3 approached combat strength. But hardware was not Marshall's deepest concern. The real crisis was leadership. The generals who commanded this hollow force were too old, too slow, and too comfortable. Marshall saw what he later called pronounced arterial hardening. Men who had spent decades waiting their turn now occupied command positions they were unfit to hold. Within 2 years, Marshall would force 600 officers into retirement. He would shatter friendships. He would enrage Congress. And he would create the generation of commanders who won the Second World War. The rot had been growing for 20 years. America's peacetime promotion system operated entirely on seniority. An officer advanced only when someone above him died or retired. Merit barely mattered. Initiative was often punished. The safest path to promotion was silence, patience, and political connections. The result was a bottleneck military planners called the Hump. More than 4,200 officers, nearly 1/3 of the entire regular Army officer corps, were crammed into a narrow age band. These men had entered service during the Great War, earned rapid wartime promotions, and then watched their careers freeze for 2 decades. The statistics were grim. Over 1,800 captains were in their 40s. More than 1,000 officers qualified by experience for lieutenant colonel remained stuck as captains. 234 lieutenants, the Army's most junior commissioned rank, were also in their 40s. Some had worn the same bars for more than 20 years. Marshall understood the problem personally. He had been a colonel during the First World War, serving as chief of operations for divisions and corps in France. After the armistice, Marshall was reduced to captain. Wartime ranks evaporated overnight. He spent 15 additional years clawing back to colonel. The system that nearly destroyed his own career was now his to dismantle. The generals commanding the Army in 1939 had survived by patience, not performance. They had waited their turn, avoided mistakes, and outlasted rivals. The traits that made them successful in peacetime, caution, deference, bureaucratic skill, were precisely the traits that would get soldiers killed in modern combat. In April 1940, Marshall testified before Congress and stated his philosophy plainly. Leadership in the field, he said, depends to an important extent on one's legs and stomach and nervous system. It depends on one's ability to withstand hardships and lack of sleep and still be disposed energetically and aggressively to command men, to dominate men on the battlefield. The generals he had inherited could not meet this standard. Most, Marshall believed, were too old to command under the crushing pressure of modern warfare. Their thinking was locked in outdated patterns. They could not change to meet new realities. This was not theory. Marshall had studied German operations in Poland and France. He had observed how speed, aggression, and decentralized decision-making shattered larger forces that relied on methodical approaches. The Germans had introduced a new style of war. Their commanders decided in hours what traditional armies took days to consider. The generals who would lead American soldiers against such an enemy needed to think differently. They needed to move quickly, decide quickly, and accept calculated risks. They needed the physical endurance to command from forward positions, not from comfortable headquarters miles behind the fighting. They needed the moral courage to make brutal decisions when lives hung in the balance. Removing senior officers was no simple task. The Army's traditions stretched to the Revolution. Officers had allies in Congress, ties to industry, classmates scattered throughout the service. The political risks were immense. Every general Marshall pushed aside had former subordinates who would remember. Every forced retirement created enemies who might sabotage him later. Marshall was not merely reorganizing the Army. He was upending a way of life. Marshall proceeded regardless. He began informally, using his authority as Chief of Staff to reassign officers to lesser posts, to bypass them for promotion, to encourage early retirements. When these measures proved insufficient, he sought legislative authority to remove officers directly. The mechanism became known as the Plucking Board, though its official designation was the Removal Board. The Second Supplemental Appropriation Act of 1940 gave Marshall the power he needed by eliminating the requirement that promotions below brigadier general occur solely through seniority. The board consisted of 6 retired general officers deliberately chosen so active duty officers would not judge potential rivals. Marshall asked his immediate predecessor, General Mahlon Craig, to come out of retirement and chair the board. Craig had served as Chief of Staff from 1935 to 1939 and commanded wide respect. His presence gave the process legitimacy. Marshall's instructions to the board established the governing philosophy. The mission is not to weigh a long and successful career against a failure in 1940 or 1941. Rather, it is to determine the worth and value of the individual to the Army today. Critical times are upon us. The measure must be today's performance. Officers removed by the board received 1 year to retire, a more dignified exit than immediate dismissal, but an unmistakable end. The board's authority was sweeping. In summer and fall 1941 alone, the board removed 31 colonels, 117 lieutenant colonels, 31 majors, 16 captains, and 269 National Guard and Reserve officers. In the 5 years before Marshall took command, only 37 officers total had been removed, an average of fewer than 8 annually. Marshall increased the removal rate more than 5-fold. Ultimately, 500 colonels were forced into retirement. Marshall estimated he pushed out at least 600 officers before the United States entered the war. The scale became clear during the Louisiana maneuvers of August and September 1941. These massive exercises involved nearly 500,000 troops across Louisiana and East Texas, the largest military exercises in American history to that point. Marshall moved constantly between command posts, observing how generals reacted to setbacks, how they communicated with staffs, how they maintained morale. Of the 42 generals commanding a division, corps, or army during those exercises, historians estimate only 11 would hold combat commands during the war. The other 31 were pushed aside. One incident became legendary. George S. Patton, commanding the 2nd Armored Division, was supposed to be contained by a defensive line. Instead, he led his tanks on a night march around the enemy flank, moving so fast umpires could not track him. At dawn, Patton's tanks burst into the headquarters of Lieutenant General Hugh A. Drum, nominally capturing the opposing force commander. The maneuver was brilliant, aggressive, and exactly the initiative Marshall wanted. The men Marshall removed were not incompetent. Many had served honorably for decades. But Marshall applied a ruthless standard. past achievement meant nothing if an officer could not perform today. A brilliant career was irrelevant if a man's best years were behind him. One confrontation illustrated Marshall's approach. A general at Fort Leavenworth was ordered to revise the Army's training manuals to reflect lessons from German campaigns in Europe. He told Marshall the work would take 18 months. Marshall offered 3 months. The general refused. Marshall offered 4. The general insisted it was impossible. Marshall asked him to reconsider, warning, "Be very careful about that answer." When the general insisted the timeline could not be shortened, Marshall's response was immediate. "I am sorry. Then you are relieved." The incident revealed something essential about Marshall's leadership. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply stated the requirement and accepted no excuses. The manuals were completed in 4 months by other officers. Marshall showed the same coldness toward personal friends. One general ordered to France explained he could not depart quickly because his wife was away and household furniture remained unpacked. Marshall called personally to confirm this was his position. When the general said it was, Marshall replied, "Well, my God, man, we are at war and you are a general. I am sorry too, but you will be retired tomorrow." The highest profile casualty was Lieutenant General Hugh Drum, though his fate came through being passed over, rather than formally removed. Drum had reached Major General in 1930 and held nearly every top position below Chief of Staff. By every measure of seniority and experience, Drum should have become Chief of Staff. But Drum promoted his own cause so vigorously he alienated President Franklin Roosevelt. When the appointment was made in 1939, Roosevelt passed over Drum and 32 other senior officers to select Marshall, who ranked 34th in overall Army seniority. Drum never forgave the slight and never stopped maneuvering for high command. During the war, Drum was summoned to Washington, expecting to receive command of American forces in Europe. Instead, Marshall offered him the position of Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek in China. Drum objected strenuously. He said the mission was nebulous, uncertain, and indefinite. When Marshall said no large American forces would go to China, Drum remarked he would be wasted in a minor post. Marshall concluded Drum lacked enthusiasm and recommended against sending him. Joseph Stilwell was selected instead. When Stilwell was asked if he would accept the difficult China command, his response was simple: "I'll go where I'm sent." Drum was relegated to commanding the Eastern Defense Command, essentially home defense duty. He reached mandatory retirement age in September 1943. He never received the combat command he had sought for decades. The irony, Fort Drum in New York is named in his honor. No military installation bears Marshall's name. The removals made room for the officers Marshall believed could win the war. But identifying those officers required a different talent, the ability to recognize potential that had not yet been proven. A legend grew around Marshall's methods. People said he kept a little black book containing names of promising officers he had observed throughout his career. The story was repeated so often it became accepted as fact. But the little black book never existed. The George C. Marshall Foundation confirmed no such notebook was ever found among Marshall's papers. What Marshall actually possessed was an extraordinary memory. Throughout his career, he had observed officers at key positions. At Fort Benning, where he served as assistant commandant from 1927 to 1932, in China, in Washington, in various staff roles. He noted who showed initiative and who waited for orders, who could think clearly under pressure and who froze. The list of promising officers existed entirely in his mind. He could recall conversations from years earlier, impressions formed in passing, potential glimpsed in a single exercise or staff meeting. This mental catalog, accumulated over decades, would determine who led American forces into battle. The selection of Dwight D. Eisenhower demonstrated Marshall's methods in action. Their first meaningful contact came in 1930, when Marshall was impressed by a young major working on the American Battle Monuments Commission staff. Marshall offered Eisenhower a position on the Fort Benning faculty. Eisenhower politely declined because he already had orders for a coveted general staff assignment. The refusal did not offend Marshall. It demonstrated Eisenhower could make decisions and stick to them. Their paths crossed again at the Louisiana maneuvers in September 1941. Eisenhower was then a lieutenant colonel, serving as chief of staff for Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's Third Army. His performance caught Marshall's attention. The pivotal moment came December 14, 1941, exactly 1 week after Pearl Harbor. Marshall summoned Eisenhower to Washington. Marshall presented a grim overview of the Pacific situation. The Philippines were under attack. The Pacific Fleet had been devastated. Japanese forces were advancing across Southeast Asia. Then Marshall posed a test. What should be our general line of action? Eisenhower asked for a few hours and a desk. Marshall provided both. Several hours later, Eisenhower returned with a memorandum acknowledging the Philippines could not be saved, but arguing they could not be abandoned either. The United States had to make every effort to support the defenders, even if ultimately futile, because abandoning them would destroy American credibility with allies throughout the Pacific. This analysis became the core Pacific strategy. More importantly, it demonstrated exactly what Marshall wanted. Eisenhower had not asked for more information. He had not requested a committee to study the problem. He had analyzed the situation, reached a decision, and presented a clear recommendation. Marshall's response revealed his philosophy. Eisenhower, the department is filled with able men who analyze their problems well, but feel always compelled to bring them to me for final solution. I must have assistants who will solve their own problems and tell me later what they have done. Eisenhower had passed the test. Marshall assigned him to the War Plans Division. By February 1942, just 2 months later, Eisenhower was chief of the entire War Plans Division. His subsequent rise was the fastest of any general in the Second World War. From lieutenant colonel in December 1941, he became a 5-star general of the Army by December 1944. George S. Patton presented a different challenge. Marshall had known Patton since the First World War. The two men were a study in contrasts. Marshall was reserved, methodical, self-effacing. Patton was flamboyant, impulsive, and utterly convinced of his destiny. Marshall regarded Patton as the Allies' best fighting general, but recognized he required management. At 54, Patton fell into the category of officers who might have been pushed aside under Marshall's age standards. He survived the Plucking Board's review only because he demonstrated the energy and drive of a much younger man. His performance in the Louisiana maneuvers proved age had not diminished his capabilities. Marshall elevated Patton from colonel in July 1938 to 4-star general by April 1945. The journey was tumultuous. Patton's mouth got him into trouble repeatedly. But Marshall protected him because he recognized Patton was irreplaceable. Twice during the war, Marshall intervened to save Patton's career. In Sicily, Patton slapped 2 soldiers suffering combat fatigue. Eisenhower, commanding the Mediterranean theater, considered sending Patton home in disgrace. Marshall counseled patience. Patton was too valuable to lose. After the Knutsford affair in England, when Patton made impolitic remarks that nearly cost him his command on the eve of the Normandy invasion, Marshall again protected him. Omar N. Bradley represented yet another path to high command. He had served as a tactics instructor at Fort Benning during Marshall's tenure as assistant commandant. Marshall described Bradley as quiet, unassuming, capable, with sound common sense. These were not flashy qualities, but they were the qualities Marshall valued most. Bradley rose from brigadier general in February 1941 to 4-star general and commander of the 12th Army Group, the largest American field command in history. More than 1.3 million soldiers served under his command during campaigns in France and Germany. He later became the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Joseph W. Stilwell, known as Vinegar Joe for his sharp tongue, impressed Marshall so deeply that Marshall held open the position of chief of the tactical section at Fort Benning for a full year until Stilwell became available. Other officers wanted the job. Marshall waited for the man he wanted. When Marshall needed someone to handle the impossible China assignment Drum had rejected, Stilwell was his choice. The mission proved every bit as difficult as Drum had feared. Stilwell fought with Chiang Kai-shek, clashed with the British, and watched his forces suffer repeated defeats. But he never quit. He never asked to be relieved. He did exactly what Marshall asked of him. The roster of commanders Marshall identified and elevated reads like a history of American victory. Mark W. Clark led the Fifth Army in Italy. Courtney H. Hodges commanded the First Army in Europe. J. Lawton Collins became one of the most aggressive corps commanders in the European theater. Lucien K. Truscott led divisions and corps in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. Matthew B. Ridgway commanded airborne forces in Normandy. Walter Kruger directed the Sixth Army across the Pacific. The consequences of Marshall's reforms became clear when American forces were measured against armies that had not undergone similar transformation. France offered the most devastating contrast. When Germany attacked in May 1940, the French army possessed more tanks than the Wehrmacht. It had adequate manpower, approximately 5 million men under arms. On paper, France should have been able to resist the German onslaught. But French leadership was aged, rigid, and trapped in the patterns of the previous war. General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, was 67 during the campaign. He established headquarters at the Château de Vincennes, a medieval fortress without modern communications equipment. The headquarters had no radio, no orders traveled by motorcycle courier, a method belonging to 1914, not 1940. When the Germans punched through the Ardennes forest, an area Gamelin left defended by only 10 reserve divisions, the French command structure collapsed. Gamelin sat in what observers called tragic immobility, unable to issue decisive orders as his armies disintegrated. His replacement, General Maxime Weygand, was 73, even older than Gamelin. Weygand arrived May 19th, 9 days after the German attack began, when the breakthrough was already complete. The battle was lost before he could influence it. France fell in 6 weeks. Approximately 60,000 French soldiers died between May and June 1940. The cause was not lack of courage among troops or shortage of equipment. The cause was leadership that could not adapt to the speed and violence of modern warfare. Britain fared only marginally better in the early war years. The British officer corps maintained a rigid class-based selection system. British reforms came only after battlefield defeats forced change, nearly 3 years after the war began. By then, Britain had suffered disasters in France, North Africa, and the Far East. Germany, ironically, had a more merit-based officer evaluation system than either France or Britain. German officers were rated in 7 categories. Junior officers could command battle groups over their seniors based on tactical necessity. This flexibility gave the German army decisive advantages in the early war years. But German flexibility had limits. Adolf Hitler increasingly interfered with military operations, overruling generals based on intuition rather than analysis. Commanders who disagreed with the Führer risked their careers, and sometimes their lives. Marshall's critics charged he was destroying institutional memory, throwing away decades of accumulated experience. Service newspapers accused him of getting rid of all the brains of the Army. Congressional opposition centered on National Guard generals with political connections. When politicians questioned his efforts to replace Guard Division leadership, Marshall's response was blunt. "I am not going to leave him in command of that division, so I will put it to you this way. If he stays, I go, and if I stay, he goes." The politician backed down. When Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter passed along criticism from a friend in the Army Reserve, Marshall replied tartly, "Most of our senior officers on such duty are deadwood and should be eliminated from the service as rapidly as possible. The opposition never stopped Marshall because he possessed something his critics lacked: the absolute confidence of President Roosevelt. The president had selected Marshall over 33 more senior officers precisely because he recognized in Marshall the moral courage to make hard decisions. Roosevelt backed his chief of staff consistently. Marshall's selections were not infallible. He made mistakes and learned from them. He was especially fond of Lloyd R. Fredendall. Fredendall commanded the largest task force in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, in November 1942. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Fredendall proved disastrous. His command post was located 70 miles behind the front lines. He issued confusing orders using a personal code his subordinates could not understand. When German forces attacked, American units were positioned poorly and coordinated worse. The result was the worst American defeat of the European War. More than 6,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. But the system Marshall created allowed for correction. Fredendall was relieved and replaced by Patton, who transformed the defeated corps into a fighting force within weeks. During the war, 16 Army division commanders were relieved for cause, along with at least 5 corps commanders. Critically, the system permitted second chances. At least 5 generals who were relieved of combat command were later given another division to lead. This flexibility distinguished the American approach from both the German and British systems. German commanders who failed were often shot or imprisoned. British commanders who failed were rarely given second opportunities. The American system treated failure as information rather than disgrace. The transformation Marshall achieved can be measured in numbers. When he took command in September 1939, the Army had fewer than 190,000 soldiers. By the end of 1941, it exceeded 1.4 million. By 1943, nearly 7 million. At its peak, in March 1945, the United States Army numbered more than 8 million soldiers organized into 91 divisions. The army that stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, bore no resemblance to the force Marshall had inherited 5 years earlier. But equipment alone did not win battles. The men who led those soldiers had been selected, trained, and tested by the system Marshall created. They were the best officers the American military could produce, and they led from the front. Winston Churchill called Marshall the true organizer of victory and the noblest Roman of them all. Eisenhower declared, "Our army and people have never been so indebted to any soldier." Harry Truman said simply, "Millions of Americans gave their country outstanding service. George C. Marshall gave it victory." Time magazine named Marshall Man of the Year twice, in 1943 and 1947. He became the first and only career soldier to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, awarded in 1953 for the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after the war. He served as both Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, the only person in American history to hold both positions. The officers Marshall removed faded into obscurity. Their names appear in no histories of the war. Some accepted their fate with dignity, understanding the mission was greater than any individual career. Others harbored resentment for the rest of their lives. The officers Marshall promoted became legends. Eisenhower served 2 terms as President of the United States. Bradley became a 5-star general and the most respected military figure of the post-war era. Patton died in a car accident months after the German surrender, but his name became synonymous with aggressive leadership. Marshall himself sought no glory. When Roosevelt died in April 1945 and Harry Truman became president, many assumed Marshall would receive command of the invasion of Japan. Instead, Marshall remained in Washington, coordinating the global war effort from his desk. When Eisenhower was selected to command the Normandy invasion, a position Marshall had wanted, he accepted the decision without complaint. Truman offered Marshall the chance to become military governor of Germany after the war. Marshall declined. He wanted to go home to his garden in Leesburg, Virginia, but retirement proved impossible. Truman needed him in China as a special envoy, then as Secretary of State, then as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. Marshall served until his health failed, always answering when his country called. The lesson of Marshall's officer purge extends beyond military affairs. Organizations of all kinds face the same challenge. How do you remove people who have done nothing wrong except grow old in their positions? How do you make room for new talent when existing leaders have earned their places through years of faithful service? How do you balance loyalty to individuals against responsibility to the institution? Marshall's answer was uncompromising. The measure must be today's performance. Past achievements, personal friendships, political connections, none could be allowed to outweigh current capability. The mission was too important. The stakes were too high. Men would die if leaders could not lead. Marshall stated his philosophy in words that deserve to be remembered. The truly great leader overcomes all difficulties. Campaigns and battles are nothing but a long series of difficulties to be overcome. The lack of equipment, the lack of food, the lack of this or that are only excuses. The real leader displays his quality in his triumphs over adversity, however great it may be. He had another saying that captured his approach. If leadership depends purely on seniority, you are defeated before you start. You give a good leader very little, and he will succeed. You give mediocrity a great deal, and they will fail. This principle, demanding excellence, accepting no excuses, measuring leaders by results, transformed an army ranked 19th in the world into the force that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It remains Marshall's enduring legacy.